Welcome to today's webinar, Write It Once, Support It Less, Build Tech Documentation that Reduces Support Tickets. This is Sheba and I'll be your co-host for tonight. Now I am delighted to introduce our speaker, Franklin Winston, Senior Technical Writer and UX Content Specialist at Google Operations Center. He brings over 8 years of experience in enterprise documentation and content strategy. His work sits at the intersection of content, quality, and user experience. Franklin is known for creating clear, structured content that addresses real user needs. He is passionate about reducing operational friction through effective communication. Beyond documentation, he actively contributes to evolving the role of technical writing. His focus on measurable impact and refined content strategy sets him apart in the field. In this session, he'll cover how to turn support tickets into actionable insights, identify high-impact gaps in documentation, and structure content for clarity and task completion. He will also share strategies to reduce repetitive support queries, collaborate effectively with support and product teams, and leverage real-world signals such as ticket trends and user search behavior to continuously refine content and improve self-service success rates. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box and we'll make sure to address towards the end of the session. With that, I'll hand it over to Franklin. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Shiba, for the wonderful introduction. Hello, everyone. Good evening. And let me introduce quickly myself. Myself, Franklin. I'm a software engineer by degree, but then turned into editor turned writer for the past few years. Currently, I work at Google Operations Center as a senior technical writer and UX content specialist. But my primary focus is on creating structured technical documentation for complex platforms and enterprise workflows. So today we'll be discussing on how to reduce support tickets via effective documentation, I would say, because tech documentation requires a lot of focus, right? It requires a lot of attention to detail. And one of the major parameters which I have identified over the years, which help in building a good product, is always effective documentation. So in today's session, I'll be walking you through my ideas on how I've been able to create effective documentation with lesser support tickets. Right. So what's the primary problem here? So what I have understood is that most users don't read documentation, right? They skim through it and they just maybe have an attention span of maybe 20 seconds. They'll just walk through a 100-word, 2000-word document and just fail to understand it and quickly is a support ticket, right? That is where we need to understand that it's fundamental behavioral pattern. Users don't consume documentation the way we design, the technical writers want to design it. They're not reading it sequentially or trying to understand the entire system, right? They're operating under time pressure and they have a very specific goal in mind. So what we need to focus is that we need to understand as a technical writer that our audience is here to scan. They would just pick what seems relevant to them and then they attempt a solution. And if the attempt fails even once or even twice maximum, they'll abandon the documentation and move to tech support, right? Or there's a ticket saying that the so-called documentation is not effective enough, provide us more assistance. So this is not a usability failure on the user's part. I would say it's a mismatch between how documentation is written and how it is actually being used, right? Now, what's the real problem, right? So I would say when support tickets come in, the default assumption in many content teams is that the users do not follow the documentation correctly, which is partly true, but at the same time I would recommend as technical writers to take a step back, look at patterns, especially repeated issues. If you're able to identify that there's a repeated issue or a repeated pattern in which the system is breaking down, that is where you identify where the fault is, right? In my understanding over the years, there are majorly three reasons on why users are not able to understand the right content and they're not able to understand what we're delivering. It might be primarily because it's not discoverable at the right moment, or it might be not structured for the task completion rate, or it might not align with the user's actual intent. So is it explorable? Is it easy to follow, or is it serving the purpose? These three factors has to be kept in mind so that from the time we start documenting a technical writing article, you would be able to solve the problem in a much effective manner, right? So understand that the real problem is not the absence of documentation, it's the ineffectiveness of documentation in real usage scenarios. right? Now let's rethink support tickets, right? I would say support tickets has been a major parameter with which even quality has been assessed in writing platforms across the world, right? They treat as support tickets as probably a measure in which to even understand the quality of content which is being provided, which is not the case. Support tickets, in fact, it has operational overheads, something to manage, something to reduce, and something to optimize is what I understand. From a documentation standpoint, these support tickets is one of the most reliable source of truth. Why? Because if a user is able to read the content and if they are not able to reach the desired outcome, they definitely raise a ticket so that they need the right outcome, right? So this represents a real user friction. Rethinking support tickets, right? So support tickets at a point in time, what we need to understand is how can we understand support tickets as not just noise and as signals. This is the most important session part of this particular session today, on to understand why it has to be considered as signals, right? Signals, as in what you need to understand is support tickets come when users don't understand what the particular documentation is trying to put across, right? So what does bad documentation look like? Now, bad documentation means there should be a clear shift, right? A shift from the impact of ineffective documentation is often underestimated in my point of view. At a surface level, it just increases support volume, but beyond that, it has much deeper implications. For example, it slows down user onboarding and adoption. It increases dependency on for the support teams. It creates an inconsistent user experience, which is primarily a great negative impact. And over time, it erodes user confidence also in the product. So a product documentation, when we are implementing on a tech standpoint, what all of you need to understand is that as technical writers, bad documentation doesn't mean bad document. It in the long run becomes a bad product as a whole, right? So what you need to understand is from an operational standpoint, this translates directly into increased cost and reduced efficiency. So documentation quality is not just a content concern in my point, it's an operational and business concern. When you look at it in that angle, it will be much more effectively optimizable content in my point of view. Now, where is the shift which we have to make, right? So the role of documentation has evolved over the years, in my understanding, wherein we move from thinking about documentation as a repository of information to treating it as a system designed to prevent user friction. This means we have to shift from completedness to effectiveness. We have to shift from coverage to usability. And rather than large volume, you have to shift towards impact. A well-designed documentation should enable users to complete tasks independently without needing to escalate to support. That's the benchmark which we need to set up, right? Now, the framework. How can we operationalize this? How can we create a system in which great documentation can be created by reducing support tickets? First and foremost, capture signals from real world user interactions. At what point in the document is the user not able to understand what we're trying to communicate? At how much time is the user taking in raising a support ticket? Is the content too long? Is the content too technical heavy? Or how to identify what is the highest impact gaps in a content? All these are very critical from a technical writing standpoint to understand that when we fix content in a structured, user-focused way. Structured content is very easy to understand, but people come with an expectation that they can understand what is in this documentation by just in the first 10 to 20 seconds. If we are not able to convey that, immediately we lose the user's attention. Finally, in this framework, we need to measure impact also. Impact on how we are able to create better content with reduced friction, right? Now, how to capture signals. So to capture signals, I have understand this chat logs is a very good form of information where we can understand where the user is failing a challenge, right? Support tickets are mostly the most direct source wherein you can just read the support ticket and you understand where the users are failing. But chat logs, real world chat logs, maybe with an AI or even with an agent, will help you understand the context on what is the confusion primarily before the escalation has happened, right? Another metric is failed searches, search queries, right? Search queries tell what the user expect to find, and failed searches are particularly valuable because they highlight unmet expectations. Because if they search something and they're not able to even find it in the documentation, there's fundamentally something wrong with what we've written. That's another metric which we can use, right? So when you combine all these four inputs, you'll start to see patterns, not isolated issues like one issue from one user. Mostly what I've understood is, while having gone through support tickets over the last few years, no issue is isolated. You can see a pattern. You can see a pattern in where the user is failing to understand our documentation. And that is where meaningful improvements will begin, right? Now, once we have the capture the signals, then it's about identifying the gaps and fixing the content. Now, how do we identify the gaps? Once you have visibility, the next step is prioritization. Not all gaps might be important per se, right? Some might be high frequency issue. That is where we should put our first priority on. Second would be repeated support patterns, and third would be onboarding blockers. When it comes to fixing content, the mistake what I've seen many teams make is that they make superficial editing. They'll just make an edit to the on a peripheral level, which would not in fact give any value addition to the user, right? Rather than that, you need to design your content around tasks, not features. Of course, we have product documentation. When product documentation is done, we do focus on features. But when it comes to a user, if you design your content around task-based, clearer steps, it would be more efficient for them or more easier for them to access your content. Right? Another way to fix content would be to use real examples, real world examples like screenshots. You give a walkthrough, you give a GIF video. This kind of clear sequential steps will enable the user to understand the content in a much more efficient manner, right? And needless to say, remove ambiguity. If your content has ambiguous content in it, ambiguous steps in it, which is clearly not serving the user in any manner, right? So this is like a very simple high level illustration I can give you. Instruction is set up in two different ways, right? First, you can see, which is a very descriptive documentation. It communicates capability, but not execution. Users can config settings via dashboard. Yes, it does convey a clear message, but it doesn't tell the how part of it, right? Now, if you the second part of it, I have given a more structured, restructured method to do the same step in a actionable step format. This reduces interpretation effort for the user. It minimizes their decision points and it increases the task success rate. And if the task success rate is increased, of course, documentation or support tickets would be significantly reduced. Now, after we have restructured our content also, we need to measure impact and constantly work with the support team, because support team take the brunt of all the, I would say, customer queries and user escalations, right? Having a constant communication with the support team clearly helps us understand where the pain points are, right? So in measuring, I would say the major three parameters I look forward to is ticket volume, search success, and feedback, right? Ticket volume, if it's coming down, it's a clear indication that the documentation you are prepared or the rework documentation has been giving good outcome or good input to the users, right? Search success, if it is increasing, that also means that the documentation is done in a clear way wherein there's improvement in search success. The feedback, of course, every documentation will have a feedback mechanism. If the feedbacks are changing positively, that also means that your documentation is hitting the right audience, right? Now, of course, support teams surface the problems, documentation teams solves the problems, right? So when this feedback loop is tight, you create a system that continuously improves itself automatically. Moving on, common mistakes, again, what I've understood is static documentations, right? So don't treat documentations statically, like don't treat them as just a user manual for people to come and read through. We're not in that era anymore, right? Create dynamic documentations, create user diagrams, create task flows, create flow charts, create some small GIF videos. This will give your documentation enough spark so that the user would be able to understand your documentation in a much efficient manner, right? Stop over explaining, right? Your role as a technical writer in documentation content is not to over explain the content. It's to simplify action for your user, right? Another common mistake which I've seen is ignoring user data. That is a very, I would say, common mistake, which shouldn't be the case. Don't rely on assumptions. Use user data and always rework your content and modify it and make it better, right? Finally, prioritize completeness over clarity. Some people, just to ensure that some writers, of course, not all, explain them, but they go for completedness. They go for clarity. They just keep explaining each step and then go on a broader scale, and that just takes the attention span away from the users, right? Effective documentation is not about covering every detail. It's about enabling users to succeed quickly and confidently, right? So finally, some advanced tips and key takeaways. Of course, we live in the era of AI. It is increasingly part of documentation workflow across the globe. So what I understood in my last 2 to 3 years of work with AI is that it helps in identifying patterns, right? It's very effective in generating drafts also. We have several AI tools, AI agents available these days, which identifies patterns across tickets and logs much efficiently in a much quicker manner than human beings. It even summarizes large volumes of data at a very quick span of time, which is very useful for us. But at the same time, AI can't replace contextual judgment, right? It does not understand user intent deeply. It cannot guarantee accuracy in complex systems. That is where a human, intellect comes in, right? Critical thinking comes in. That is where technical writers play a major role. I believe AI has to be integrated in our workflows in a very shrewd manner, wherein we take the best out of both worlds, right? Another thing is, which I would like to all of you take away from this particular session, is to use documentation as a method in which you can focus on high impact content gaps, right? Content gaps will be there in every document, but use your intellect, use your support ticket knowledge, use your, you know, AI tools available to understand what's going wrong. Use it as an augmentation tool and understand that it's not going to replace you. AI can't replace critical thinking, right? It can help you make your job better, but there has to be someone to prompt it, right? I hope all of you have heard about prompt engineering as well. That is where a human being comes in and gives the right input to the AI so that we can get the right output and tweak it and make it better. And to summarize, I would say consistently treat support tickets as an input for improving your document quality.
Thank you, Franklin. The session was quite insightful, and I'm sure the audience will agree. And that's a wrap for today's session. Thanks a lot to you for walking us through the topic. I hope the insights shared today gave everyone a clearer understanding of how to transform support signals into actionable documentation that reduces friction and drives measurable operational impact. To everyone who tuned in, thank you for taking your time to be here and for all your great questions and comments. And of course, if you have more questions or want to learn more about Document 360, then feel free to reach out to us. We'll be back soon with another session. Until then, see you next time. Thank you, Franklin, and thank you everyone for joining.